Poison Dagger, a skill full of flavor but lacking in power. The necromancer stabbing enemies with a ceremonial dagger to poison enemy monsters and slowly drain their health makes a lot of sense lore-wise, and let's be honest, it is a cool skill. There is something oddly satisfying about tagging a monster once and then watching as its health bar depletes, even if slowly. But gameplay-wise, it doesn't hit the mark. So what's the problem? Well, first off, it's a melee skill which requires you to engage in close quarters combat, while the Necromancer is a caster class who doesn't have good melee support either in his combat breakpoints or supporting skills. The second thing is that the skill just doesn't do very much damage. It's single target only, and while the damage scales decently with more skill points invested, so does the duration of the poison. And this is the biggest issue in my opinion. At max level, Poison Dagger deals its damage over the course of 10 seconds, and you can't stack poison on the same enemy in Diablo 2. Add to that some poison resistance to enemy monsters and attack rating problems for the Necromancer, and we can see why nobody uses Poison Dagger. It's just a terrible skill choice. Honestly, I can't think of any reason to. Hi, I'm Sarfen, and in this video I'm going to play through Diablo 2 while using only Poison Dagger as my attack of choice. No Poison Novas, no Bone Spears, and no summoned minions. I will allow myself to use curses to debuff enemies as well as other non-damaging skills like Bone Armor, but the only damage dealing skill I can use is Poison Dagger, and I'm going to try to beat all difficulties of Diablo 2 with this guy, from level 1 all the way to hell. I created my new hero and was immediately faced with my first problem. Poison Dagger is a level 6 skill and I was only level 1, but I had an idea to get to level 6 while keeping within the rules for the challenge. I ran out into the Bloodmoor and started opening chests and other lootable terrain while dodging all enemies. Once I had collected enough junk to sell for a few hundred gold, I shopped at Charcy until I saw a green knife appear in her trade window. A Septic Dagger, a magical dagger with poison damage. Not Poison Dagger the skill, but indisputably a poison dagger. And with that I was able to start off my questing through Act 1, gathering experience while also practicing my stabbing technique. Monsters early on aren't much of a challenge, even for a spellcaster with a small blade, so it was smooth sailing for the most part. But already in the stony field against an elite pack of goatmen, I got a taste of what a melee necromancer would be like, almost falling to these low level enemies. Loot-wise, I didn't find much for the first few levels, except a magical Jewel of Envy. This wasn't anything significant for the long term, but for the early game it's a great damage booster, adding 20 damage over 2 seconds to your attacks. And what is extra nice with this jewel is that it can go in any socket, so I could boost my damage from my armor slot, which is otherwise hard to come by in the early game. And shortly after I did hit level 6, which meant that I had unlocked my main skill. At level 1 it only had 7 to 15 poison damage over 2 seconds for 3 mana per attack, and I just want to highlight that that's way less than what my Jewel of Envy added for free. But of course I didn't have to choose between them, and for now I had a pretty strong attack, capable of taking down most monsters in a single hit. I had also put skill points into Teeth and Corpse Explosion as prerequisites for Poison Explosion, which I wouldn't be able to use, but it is a damage synergy for Poison Dagger. I also had a point in Bone Shield for a small defensive buffer, and a few points into the Curse Tree as prerequisites for the later curses. Though with Poison Dagger being so mana hungry on its own, I didn't really use any curses yet. I defeated the Countess a few times, not so much for the rune drops, but because of the many elite monsters in the tower giving good experience. Though in the tower I found a magical preserved head with plus 2 skeleton, skeleton mastery and corpse explosion. This would have been a great offhand on a summoner. Of course I found it on a Poison Dagger run, so I left it in the tower for future necromancers to find. When I hit level 14, I decided to continue through Act 1. Poison Dagger was level 9 at this point, which gave my stabs a good damage boost and a great attack rating boost. I had also found some nice plus to bone armor items which I kept on my weapon switch to pre-buff the bone armor for extra tankiness. And for now, I was one-tapping every monster with these. My next obstacle was Andariel, a fellow poison enthusiast just like me, except her poison has range, she's tankier, and her physical damage is no joke either. Luckily I had a lot of antidote potions, health potions, and mana potions to make up the difference. She also didn't really take advantage of her advantages, as I was able to lure her round and round the hole in the floor while tagging her with Poison Dagger every now and then to keep the poison ticking, and before long she fell to the floor.
Back to the hell that spawned you, andariel.
In Act 2 I began by bringing out the greedy Goblin in me and shopped for some gloves with Magic Find, then some gloves with even more Magic Find, and then some boots with Magic Find. With the 25 from the gloves and 21 from the boots, coupled with 18 from topazes in my helm and a baby 6 from my amulet, I was able to hit a total of 70% increased Magic Find, which was quite nice for Act 2 normal. It wouldn't help me in combat at all, but I felt like I needed to maximize my chances for good loot as long as possible if I were to have any chance later in the game. In the sewers I was having a bit of a hard time against the skeleton archer and mages, especially elite packs. I began using the dim vision curse, and that really helped me out by blinding all minions and non-elite enemies, which meant that they didn't attack me unless I walked right up to them. I thought it would be a good idea to start investing some more into curses, but the issue was that I also needed to pump all of my skill points into Poison Dagger to keep its damage decent. For now I had dim vision for free from a necro offhand that I imbued at Charcy before leaving Act 1, but I had a feeling that I would need to lean more heavily into curses eventually if I wanted to have any chance of staying alive later in the game. But that was a worry for later. For now I took down Radamant in a tricky battle, once again making good use of dim vision to keep his minions off of me to give me room to shank the mummy, and graciously accepted the reward of a free skill point. The desert areas were easier since I had more room to maneuver around enemies, and it was important for me to not get surrounded, not only because it would mean a lot of incoming damage, but the Necromancer has slow hit recovery compared to the classes actually intended for melee combat, meaning I wouldn't have much chance of attacking if I kept getting hit over and over. And I get that the video is showing me almost dying just after saying it was easier, but strong elite still dealt damage to me fast. I was not strong defensively at all, and I did not see many ways to improve that at the moment, apart from making sure to recast bone armor as soon as it ran out. The run was already struggling a little, but for now it worked fine and I was able to quest through Act 2 at a decent pace. I also felt like I was a little slow moving, especially against fast enemies, which made it harder to run away from danger, so I went ahead and put Talon F from the Countess into a body armor to make stealth, which not only has a nice amount of faster run walk, but also a good amount of faster hit recovery, which was very welcome, and the other stats are decent as well. When I hit level 18, I increased my dexterity to over 45, which meant that I could equip the Chris Dagger. I shopped Farah for a bit and got a 2-socketed one with mana leech. I put a Sapphire Gem and a Tur Rune into it for some slow and some more mana regen, because Poison Dagger had become very mana hungry at this point. The rest of Act 2 was as smooth as you can expect from a Poison Dagger only Necromancer. I took down regular enemies in one stab and dipped in and out of combat under the safety of my bone armor. But then it was time to face Duriel, and I was very skeptical about my chances against him as a melee Necromancer. Not only does he deal a lot of damage, his freezing aura also further slowed my already tardy old man of a hero. But as it turned out, I didn't really need to fight Duriel in melee at all. I just had to stab him once every now and then spend the rest of my time running circles around this little cave and wait for the poison to do its thing. The run speed from the stealth armor proved to have been an important upgrade for me, and after a few minutes, Duriel was defeated. Not a very noble victory, but what did you expect from a poisoning, backstabbing Necromancer? The defining characteristic of Act 3, apart from the damn jungle taking you for a loop to backtrack and trap you in the Great Marsh, is that there are a lot of enemies swarming you. I was expecting this to be just awful for this character, but when I actually got there it was honestly not that bad. Maybe my expectations for this guy were a bit too low, or maybe my defenses were better than I thought they were, but progress in Act 3 was surprisingly manageable. I found the Gidbin in the jungle, and this is a quest item that you'll turn in right away for a reward, but it is also a dagger class weapon. And after turning in the dagger to Ormus, he gave me this rare ring, which was pretty decent. Attack rating and mana would help Poison Dagger, and cold resist and magic damage reduction would help me to survive. And that was certainly welcome, because for some reason I was running around with my bare chest exposed. The High Council of Travancore bested me in hand-to-hand combat, but I was able to overcome them with a tactic of hit and run, then some hit and run, and finally some more hit and run. Then it was time for me to face the third act boss, Mefisto. The damage output of his magic made my health pool look like a level 2 rat in a tutorial, but his aim could really use some work, because I could easily dodge his attacks, and with good timing I was even able to sneak a stab in every now and then without dying. But the Lord of Hatred is a cunning schemer, and he had planted a unique ring in a random chest in his area, and when that dropped it disrupted my focus so much that he was able to snipe me while I was staring at the shiny object on the ground. Well played, Mefisto, well played. I was able to walk back to the fight, and with no more tricks up his sleeves I was able to take Mefisto down. It dropped a green scepter which was of no use to me, but the ring from the chest was a Nagel ring with 25% MF, 58 attack rating and 3 magic damage reduction, helping my chance to hit and bringing my magic find to over 100% in total. Very nice. Despite being a bit fragile, I was doing pretty well. Poison Dagger kept getting stronger with every level and my damage was good, still taking down most enemies in one hit, only that it took a few seconds before the enemies admitted defeat. Isuel tried his best, as did Mefisto, and as did all of the Chaos Sanctuary. The Oblivion Knights are immune to dim vision, which was a shame because it would have been great to be able to shut them down at a range, but they weren't immune to daggers or poison. As much as I've been complaining about this character so far, once I fully adopted the hit and run playstyle, it was actually a pretty solid character, at least for a challenge run. And it was surprisingly fun to play too, if you like playing dirty, because this character really was a little asshole. blinding enemies so they couldn't see me sneak up on them, stabbing them in the back with an old rusty knife to infect them with poison, and then run away like a coward. Diablo in normal is a difficult fight for traditional melee characters, but I found this fight to be easy. It still took a really long time to wear Diablo down this way, but I only had to run in and attack every now and then, and could time my strikes to when he did something other than his lightning attack. And apart from that, it was just a matter of dodging his fairly predictable spells, and a few minutes later, Diablo went down.
Lord Diablo,
Starting Act 5 didn't offer much difficulty, with the big outer areas giving me lots of room to run around and enemies being generally weaker and less poison resistant than in Act 4, I was able to go through with relative ease. But I made sure to take my time to fight lots of monsters, to make sure I didn't fall too far behind on levels, because while Poison Dagger does add a big bonus to your attack rating, the level difference between you and the thing you attack also has a big impact on your chance to hit, and not connecting with the stabs meant no poison, which meant no damage and no fun. In Act 5 I did encounter my first poison immune enemy, in the form of a door. Luckily I could still hack the door down with my Poison Dagger attack. Shout out to the 2-11 physical damage from my dagger. I did find a pretty cool helm on my way through, a circlet with +1 to Necromancer skills, which significantly increased my damage. It hurt my greedy goblin soul to give up the magic find, but this was just too good of an item compared to 26 MF. The fire damage could be decently useful as well, even if it was very little compared to my poison damage. If for nothing else, it would allow me to knock down poison immune doors faster. I did rescue Anya from the frozen river for the quest reward of a free extra 10 to all resistances, which was very welcome, but after that I headed straight for the Ancients and the end of the act as fast as possible, and I think it's time for a character overview. I took on the Ancients at level 29, which was a bit lower than I would have liked. I had tried to get as much experience as I could on the way, but with only a single target damage over time attack, I couldn't be bothered to clear all optional areas, or areas infested with those annoying teleporting imps. I had maxed out Poison Dagger at this point, sitting at level 21 with a +1 from my helm. In addition, I had 7 points into Poison Explosion, giving me plus 140% damage to my Poison Dagger via synergy, and the damage was perfectly decent. I would even go as far as to say it was good. I also had 1 point in Bone Armor, which I recast as often as I could. And for curses, I had not advanced the tree any further since unlocking Poison Dagger, instead favoring to maximize my damage. I would soon be able to unlock Lower Resist, which could lower enemy poison resistance, but that would require me to invest a total of 7 skill points into the curses tree, just for a level 1 Lower Resist, and right now I thought those points were better spent in synergies for Poison Dagger instead. But as I said, the damage output of Poison Dagger was actually pretty good, so the fight against the Ancients wasn't bad. With Bone Armor keeping me safe while I ran in to tag them with my dagger, I could then run away from them to dodge their attacks while they were slowly drained. First Madoc, then Korlik, and finally Talik. On the second wave in the throne room, I encountered my first poison immune enemy that wasn't a door. Akmal the Cursed was immune to my main source of damage, has an annoying entourage of resurrecting cold mages, and he's somewhat of a poisoner himself. But by blinding his friends and luring him away from Baal a bit so I wouldn't get cursed, I was able to stab him down with my Poison Dagger attack anyway. And here I was very thankful for the fire damage from my circlet, because while the 30 fire damage it added to my attack paled in comparison to the almost 2000 poison damage, it was a lot better than 2000 poison damage that didn't do anything. The only other hassle in the throne room were the final 2 waves, with the Venom Lords who have a high poison resistance, but there is a big difference between high resistance and immunity. And then Lister and his gang who are even more resistant to poison damage, so they took a super long time to kill, and they also cannot be blinded by dim vision, which was annoying, but on the other hand, they are also kind of slow and couldn't catch up to me, so the fight wasn't really difficult, just very boring and drawn out. I lured all of his minions out of the throne room and parked them in a corner, but I duked it out against Lister over something like 10 minutes, just to not skip all of them. Baal himself was also super annoying. I only had a 60% chance to hit him with every attack. In between that and his slow cold attacks and his mana drain, it was a real pain to get him poisoned at all. But just as with Lister, it was more annoying than difficult. I hid behind the pillars to avoid damage and only came out when it was time to reapply the poison, and then it was only a matter of time. Dropped a unique plated belt. Blade Buckle has a good amount of faster hit recovery, which would be useful, but other than that it's not a great belt, and I didn't think it was worth replacing the one I was wearing with fire resist. So now I had defeated normal with only Poison Dagger. It had been pretty grindy so far, but honestly better than expected. But this was just the beginning, and next up was Nightmare difficulty. Before starting the questline in Nightmare, I did the secret cow level a couple of times, which wasn't efficient at all with this character, but I did it anyway in hopes of some good drops. I found a Dull Rune, which was an interesting drop that I could see a use for, but I'll get back to that later. I also found a really sweet rare ring, 2 high resistance rolls, half freeze duration, and a little bit of magic find on top. Super nice. And then this dagger with 3 open sockets, which was one of the things that I was hoping to find here, with the other thing I was hoping for being a necro head with some decent skills and 2 open sockets to be able to make some rune words in later. I had found a few plain heads that could get socketed by Larsuk, but none of them was really what I was looking for, lacking any good skill rolls. In Nightmare Act 1 I took the dagger I found and made the Malice rune word. My chance to hit had been getting worse and worse towards the end of normal, and this was a very nice solution to that problem, boosting my attack rating and lowering enemies' defenses at the same time. It also has a 100% chance to cause open wounds, which fit very well with Poison Dagger, both in playstyle and in flavor. Malice did drain my own life pool over time though, which was annoying even if the drain was slow. Hopefully I would be able to find some life replenishment gear later to make up for it, but for now drinking a lot of health potions would work decently enough. I spent a fair bit of time in Act 1, mainly at the Forgotten Tower to farm runes from the Countess. And remember that doll rune that I found from the cows that I was excited about? Well, on one of the kills the Countess dropped both doll and Io, which is the complete white rune word. That's a great weapon for a poison and bone necromancer. But unfortunately, it can't be made in daggers and you can't stab enemies with wands in this game, so it's not broken for Poison Dagger like it would be for a regular Poison Necro. But I was still excited because I was using bone armor a lot and had my entire weapon switch dedicated to pre-buffing the skill, and for that, white would be great. Now I had not saved any wands with 2 open sockets, so I went back to Act 2 normal and bought a white bone wand with +2 to bone armor. I took that to Larsuk in Act 5 and added sockets to it. It felt a little wasteful to use my only socketing quest on a weapon for my pre-buff weapon switch, but in so many runs I've ended up not using the socketing quests at all, so I figured it would be better to use it on this than not use it at all. And with the white rune word made in that wand, it gave me a whopping +8 to bone armor, giving my weapon switch a level 13 bone armor in total, which absorbed 200 physical damage. A pretty decent defensive upgrade. Other highlights from my Nightmare Countess grind were a Hell rune, 2 Soul runes, 3 M runes, and 1 Shale rune. I hadn't decided exactly what to do with them yet, but some of these would surely be turned into something useful later. But as I didn't need upgrades immediately, I held off on using them to see if I could find any really good base items first. I made it through the act and fought Andariel. My poison resistance was good, bone armor absorbed her physical damage, and my poison dealt good damage to her, so it was not a difficult fight. I was slightly annoyed that I had been wearing between 70 and 100% magic find for almost the entire game so far and had not found a single useful unique yet, but when killing Nightmare Andariel it was as if the game knew, and it showered me in rare drops. The bow was nothing special, but I thought I'd identify it anyway. The spear was Kelpie Snare, a great item for Act 2 mercenaries or anyone else who would use a spear. So a great item for Act 2 mercenaries. This has carried me hard in some past challenges, and the main thing is the 75% slow, which makes Act bosses and other big single enemies so much less dangerous. The set helm was from the Tancred set, the Tancred set, the Tancred set, which I probably would never use on this character, and finally the unique amulet, Eye of Eklich. Now that's a nice drop. +1 skills on the amulet slot. It doesn't offer much else than that, but +1 skills translated to about 300 more damage per stab with Poison Dagger. Very nice. But despite that boost, in Act 2 my damage output was really starting to slow down, and enemy damage output ramp up. It was probably a combination of more poison resistant enemies and more elemental damage, which couldn't be blocked by bone armor. So for Act 2 I used dim vision liberally and only killed enemies that I absolutely had to. Which, to be fair, there are a lot of in Act 2 thanks to the Maggot Lair and all the tomb areas being clogged up by enemies. In Talrasha's tomb I found a unique pair of boots. Tearhunch has some nice stats, especially compared to the magic find boots I was still wearing at this point, though they did require 70 strength, which I was far from having, so I stashed them until I was strong enough to wear them. I used the same strategy against Duriel as I did in normal, and it worked perfectly fine this time too, only it took like 5 times longer to wear him down, but down he went. I continued spamming Dim Vision in Act 3, and for the last several levels I had put my points into boosting Dim Vision instead of Poison Dagger synergies, and that gave Dim Vision a very noticeable increase both in area coverage and duration, which was very helpful for both running past enemies and stopping enemies I had to fight from fighting back. When returning the Gidbin to Ormus, he once again paid out handsomely with another great ring, and at this point I felt it was time to say thanks and goodbye to the Nagel ring, because double resistance and over 100 attack rating was just too good to pass up. The way that Ormus was paying out great gear for this necromancer in both normal and nightmare was very unusual to me, as usually he just gives me this kind of crap. Speeding through the act on the back of Dim Vision, I soon arrived at Mefisto, and this was a wake-up call. So far I had been able to survive in Nightmare thanks to cursing every enemy and simply running away from those that I couldn't. I had been able to beat both andariel and duriel fairly easy by running away from them to minimize damage, but against Mefisto that wasn't so easy. He could cast Blizzard and Frost Nova, which are difficult to dodge, and any spell that hits me dealt a lot of damage to me, and I did have to run in occasionally to renew the poison, which meant getting right up to him, and if I had some unlucky timing and got hit with a volley of charged bolts, it was over. I died to Mefisto 3 or 4 times, which was probably a sign that I needed to upgrade my resistances a bit. My lightning resistance especially, which was barely in the positive. I was also struggling to hit him with only a 60% chance to hit with every attack. But thinking about it, I only needed to hit bosses about once every 10 seconds anyway, so it was probably more important to focus on survivability and then accept that I would sometimes need a few extra swings to hit my target. Despite the struggles, I did eventually win the fight, but it was time to make some changes. But first some loot, as Mefisto dropped a unique sword. Plaguebearer would have been an awesome weapon for another poison-based melee fighter, the Rabies Druid, but unfortunately this wasn't a dagger and I wasn't a rabid werewolf, at least not as far as I knew, so I had no use for this. When starting Act 4, I decided to respec my build and also change up my gear. I was now past the halfway point of the game, if going by the total number of acts at least, so I felt it was time to swap out my magic find items for some gear that actually did something. I started by putting enough points into strength to equip the Tearhaunch boots, upgrading from only magic find to some run speed, some stats and some resistances. I also put an Ort and a Sol into a helm to make lore, because while my old helm already had +1 to all skills, the added lightning resistance and physical damage reduction were much stronger supporting stats. I left my gloves with magic find on for now because I didn't have anything decent to replace them with yet, and same with my stealth armor, but honestly I didn't mind using it for now because Act 4 would probably be a lot of running and the run speed and faster hit recovery would be useful for that. And finally my Necrohead offhand, which only served as a boost to my dim vision level. I had the runes to make some good shield rune words, but I didn't replace this yet, as I was still kind of hoping for a 2-socket Necrohead with some good skill on it to make the rune word in. As for skills, I did decide to try investing more in curses to unlock Lower Resist and Decrepify, 2 very strong curses. Lower Resist in particular could really boost my damage, but the problem is that monsters can't be affected by dim vision and Lower Resist at the same time, and I was not confident that I would be able to survive if I ditched dim vision. There is a curse called Attract, which curses a single monster to force surrounding monsters to attack it, while also having the unique addition of this curse cannot be overridden by other curses, meaning a monster can be affected by Attract and also Lower Resist at the same time. But I felt that cursing monsters to attack each other didn't fit the challenge. If it was an effect on an item, I would have used it, but not as a skill that I cast. I rounded out the build with 1 point into Bone Armor and then 20 each into Poison Dagger and Poison Explosion, leaving some Poison Dagger damage on the table by going heavily into curses instead of into the final Poison Dagger synergy for now. And in Act 4 I ran into true poison immune regular enemies in large amounts for the first time in the form of Venom Lords. The problem was that even if Lower Resist can break their immunity, they are still left with a really high poison resistance, so while I could kill them all, it was a very slow process, and of course as I mentioned earlier, without being blinded, enemies kept chasing me around, which I was poorly equipped to handle. So I opted for my other strategy against the Venom Lords, and most of Act 4 really, because this was a tough place for this guy, which was the tried and true dim vision spam. I lured and isolated Isual alone on the stairs between 2 areas, but fighting regular enemies in Act 4 felt so unrewarding and difficult that I basically didn't fight any other enemies in the first 3 areas of the act. In the River of Flame I couldn't skip as many enemies, but being mostly melee enemies and less poison resistant, it was easier to fight here. The Hellforge gave me another soul rune and then I headed to Diablo as fast as possible. But in the Chaos Sanctuary it was like I ran straight into a wall. Packs of Venom Lords supported by Oblivion Knights chased me all around the area, giving me little time to fight back. I tried for several minutes but I just made no progress. I eventually slipped and got caught in a full surround, and well... Now, Nightmare had been a grind so far, but it had been manageable, but now I felt stuck. And in non-poison immune enemy I could handle fine, but the combination of massive amounts of Venom Lords and the curses from Oblivion Knights made it just too painful, so I decided to hire some help. I never intended to make this run without a mercenary, but after not feeling like I truly needed the help earlier, I wanted to see how long I could last without one. And, well, the answer was right here, right now. I chose Emilio because you always choose Emilio, and he also had the blessed aim aura and I had been complaining about my chance to hit for a while. I crafted him a bloodhelm for some lifesteal, bought a random magical armor from a vendor and gave him the Kelpie snare which I found from Andariel. He wasn't a superhuman warrior or anything, and his reluctance to run away from combat didn't fit great with my hit and run playstyle, but he was very helpful. Having someone to help draw some of the attention and poke down the poison immune Venom Lords was great, and allowed me to focus on crowd control and hunting down the Oblivion Knights. I was still joining in on the poking as well, even without breaking their poison immunity, because I still had the open wounds from my knife. We took down 2 of the seal bosses together, and then I took down Lord Disease on my own, assassin style. I decided to also take on Diablo alone to prove to myself that I was in fact the hero of this journey and not Emilio. It was not at all because he had died against Lord Disease and I was too lazy to resurrect him. Though in hindsight I should have resurrected Emilio at least once to let him tag Diablo with a Kelpie snare, which would have made the fight much easier, but even at normal speed I took Diablo down and we moved on to the final act of Nightmare. The first parts of Act 5 were a fair bit easier compared to Act 4, but again I made sure to not skip too much of it with Dim Vision to secure some of that experience. I even repeated a few areas to really prepare for hell. Emilio was a fierce warrior, but I was determined to not turn this into a mercenary plus curses run, so I threw myself into melee on the front lines as well, though I did really appreciate the help with knocking down the poison immune doors. The ancients were able to take down Emilio pretty early in the fight, but he managed to poke all of them before dying, meaning that Emilio supported me even from beyond the grave by slowing the barbarians down to a crawl, and I was then able to clean them up with my poison and bleed. The throne room waves were actually easier in Nightmare than in normal, thanks to higher poison damage, better curses, bleed from my dagger, and of course Emilio. Then it was just Baal left. I faced him at level 64, which is a quite high level for beating Nightmare for me. My poison dagger was dealing over 5000 damage now, but of course that's over 10 seconds, so the actual damage per second still wasn't that impressive. And worse off was my attack rating, having only 60% chance to hit Baal even at level 64. But between some cold damage, slow from Emilio, and slow from my Decrepify curse, which as you can see meant that Baal couldn't really do anything, it was still completely viable despite my medium damage and poor chance to hit. Now on to Hell difficulty. While Poison Dagger wasn't all that bad against non-poison resistant enemies, and our many ways of slowing enemies was strong against bosses, it was clear to me that this wasn't going to be an effective build for Hell, so this was my plan. Start by doing anything I could reasonably do to improve my defenses to not get one-shot, mainly increasing my resistances. Rush the act bosses as fast as possible, only stopping to fight easy elites for loot and experience, or enemies who blocked our way, and then finally grind difficult enemies down with curses, slow, poison, bleed, and Emilio. So I guess keep doing what I've been doing already. Seemed like a solid plan to me. I started by gambling some new gloves with resistances to finally replace my Magic Find gloves from Act 2 normal. Then I accepted that I wouldn't find a good Necro offhand with 2 sockets and instead put Shale and Eth into a 2-socketed Bone Shield to make rhyme for the 25 all resist and cannot be frozen. I guess I haven't really talked about it yet, but being slowed by cold damage had been a big annoyance for this character so far, and cold damage would only be more common from here on. I did lose out on +3 to Dim Vision, but by now I had invested a few points into it naturally, so it was still at a decent level. I was also planning on replacing my stealth armor with a body armor filled with runes for resistances, but I had to wait because the one I needed the most was lightning resistance, and I was somehow completely out of Ort runes. Resistances weren't looking great overall, but at least they were all in the positive. With my new plan in place, I set my aim on Andariel, but I actually found that the curses made fighting surprisingly manageable even in Hell, so at least for the first act I fought a bit more than originally planned. And it was lucky that I did, because in the stony field I found a Mal rune from a random enemy while cleaning up around Rock and Issue. This was a fun drop, because it would allow me to make the Venom rune word in a dagger, which would be very flavorful for a Poison Dagger Necromancer. Unfortunately, that rune word sucks, and I was not willing to go that far for the memes. Not on this character anyway. So instead I grabbed a 2-socketed armor from the stash and made Prudence for a significant increase to all my resistances, once I got another level up, because apparently I was relying on the plus dexterity from stealth in order to equip my dagger. I made it to Andariel and we handled the minions before her well, and lured her out of her room to avoid fighting other enemies at the same time. Emilio did not stand up to her damage despite being force-fed antidote potions before the fight. He fell because he didn't know how to run away, but I surely did, and that was once again a very effective tactic against Andariel. I beat the first act of Hell rather quickly, only spending a couple of hours here in total. This gave me a lot of hope for the challenges to come, but then again, it was only Act 1 after all. In Act 2 I traded in Emilio for Emilio, because Emilio had Holy Freeze instead of Emilio's Blessed Aim. I was really benefiting from Emilio's Blessed Aim aura, or maybe rather I was very crippled without it, but since crowd control was so important, I felt that Emilio's AoE slow would serve me better. And this was what our fighting looked like now. It wasn't easy, it wasn't fast, it was arguably barely about Poison Dagger anymore, but it was working because our enemies struggled to do much of anything. Though sometimes when Emilio died, I held off on resurrecting him for a while, just to see if I could still hold my own, and I was happy to see that I could. Against enemies with low poison resistance, I was even looking pretty strong, or maybe I was just not completely terrible and my perception of what was good had been warped after playing a Poison Dagger Necromancer for the last several days. There's not much more to say about progress in Act 2. A few hours later it was time to fight Duriel again for the last time, and seeing how I managed to cheese him in the previous 2 difficulties, I was optimistic, with Emilio even being able to stay alive to help slow the big worm down. But my chance to hit had reached catastrophic levels, with me barely being able to hit Duriel 40% of the time. And soon it proved that Emilio's strong start was a fluke, and I couldn't heal him fast enough. With a 40% chance to hit, being slowed because Duriel's Holy Freeze hit me through the Cannot Be Frozen stat on my shield, and getting knocked into hit recovery, it was very hard to land any attacks on him. But, to my surprise, he was not really dealing much damage to me either. Don't get me wrong, it was not like I could stand still and tank him, but there was time for me to miss several stabs in melee range without dying, which meant that I would eventually poison him, and then I could spend the next 10 seconds running around and drinking potions to regenerate my health before having to go in again. So in the end, I was able to defeat Duriel and moved on to Act 3. I began Act 3 by trying to do a little bit of fighting, but at least for the jungle part it was quite annoying, so I quickly changed my tactics. Once I reached Kurast, I slowed down a bit, once again to not fall too far behind on levels, and I also spent some time farming enemies and opening chests in lower Kurast for loot to sell, because I was bleeding gold in potions and Emilio credit. I started hell with over 1 million gold in my stash, and now I was down to less than 200,000, and with the hardest challenges of the game ahead of me, I would probably need a lot more than that. A while later, with a couple of extra levels in me and a few extra 100k gold in my stash, I decided to take on Travancore. As long as I only fought one of them at a time, either by luring them away or by keeping all minions blinded, it was a pretty smooth fight. It was slow, which is why I had to isolate them, because otherwise they would just heal each other way faster than I could damage them. But in the end, it was a W for Team Sarmelio. The Durance of Hate was an absolute pain. Lots of poison immune and tanky enemies, dolls, maulers, huge maps with lots of backtracking. Between poison and open wounds, my curses and Emilio, I was able to take on everything the game threw at me at this point, but it was just so slow. Every fight was a grind, and if I made a mistake and didn't curse group of enemies correctly, or if I ran into any extra dangerous elites, it would turn into a long drawn out fight with lots of retreating backwards to separate enemies, and lots of gold spent on reviving Emilio and buying potions. And at this point I had already spent over 40 hours on this challenge, so I decided to open up a shortcut. I bought a magical staff with charges of the teleport spell from Ormus, which allowed me to more easily skip areas that I didn't feel like fighting. It wasn't like I hadn't been skipping enemies already with dim vision, but that wasn't as viable anymore with these types of enemies and narrow passages in the Durance of Hate. It is very expensive to repair those teleport charges, but it was totally and completely worth it to preserve what little sanity I had left. We teleported to Mefisto, and after 6 minutes of this, we completed Act 3. Act 4 was more dim vision and teleports. I felt in a hurry to finish the rest of the game, but I did find Isuel at the edge of the map, so I decided to take him down. I also swung by the Hellforge after teleporting past most of the River of Flame, and I scored an rune. That was a really nice drop to get, a quite good rune both in itself but also for making rune words. I would surely be able to put that to good use. I then took a break from this necromancer between the Hellforge and the Chaos Sanctuary for a couple of days, and that was a good decision because I came back to the challenge with an appetite for the grind and a lot more patience, and God knows patience was required to deal with the Chaos Sanctuary. Though the break also meant that I forgot about finding the rune though, which, yeah. We slowly cleared our way to the middle of the sanctuary, and then I had a plan for summoning Diablo with minimal fighting, by teleporting in and out to activate the seals, and then slowly walking forward while spamming dim vision. I could make it so that only the seal boss would aggro on us, and then retreat to the center of the map, meaning I didn't have to deal with every minion around the seals. Diablo himself was slowed down to the point of not dealing much damage, but his Firestorm attack would still one-shot Emilio whenever he managed to cast it. That was fine though, since he didn't spam it all the time and I could just revive Emilio as needed. But here I eventually ran out of gold completely, to the point where I couldn't even afford one more Emilio. Luckily this happened so late in the fight that I was able to take down the last of Diablo's health bar on my own, which was a great victory, but being out of gold meant that Act 5 would probably be impossible. Starting Act 5, I sold all my below perfect gems, most runes and a bunch of random equipment from my stash to scrape together a little over 100k. I needed more, but now I could at least rest Emilio once and buy some potions for the gold grind. While doing this, I also remembered my rune again, which kind of felt like finding it a second time. Nice. I needed to do some gold farming, and because of the rune, I decided to go back to Nightmare Countess for that grind. It wasn't the most efficient gold farming, but I found enough random loot to sell to build a small buffer, and I also found a shale room, which was the reason for going to the Countess in the first place. Back in Hell, I used a Hell to unsocket my mercenary's armor and made duress with the shale and the arm. Some decent cold damage, some good defensive stats, but most importantly, crushing blow. That should help a lot against tough enemies. Also a 35% chance to cause open wounds, but I already had 100% on my dagger, so that was probably not a big deal. My first attempt against the Ancients was a complete mess. I could use the teleport staff to separate them easier than by foot, but even taking on just one at a time was a struggle. We just didn't deal damage fast enough and couldn't stand up to their damage long enough. We managed to take one of them down a couple of times, but Talik the Whirlwind Barbarian kept ruining every attempt. Eventually I got Talik trapped facing the edge of the map, which makes him unable to use Whirlwind, and without his main skill he was not nearly as dangerous. That way we were able to take him down first, and the other two had not spawned with anything super dangerous, like Cursed and Aura Enchanted or extra strong, so we managed to take them down as well. Then into the Worldstone Keep to finally face the ultimate challenge of this run, the Throne Room Waves and Baal. I had to pull all waves but the first one apart and only engage a few enemies at a time to stand any chance. The most difficult way was actually the second one, and not because of the poison immune mummies, but because of the mages constantly resurrecting and the mummies being unusually reluctant to walk away from the throne. But Emilio eventually shattered all the skeletons even though they are cold immune thanks to Holy Freeze, and then the mummies were a bit easier. And then the final 3 waves were easier than I thought they would be, even Lister. The final wave was once again a little bit harder to separate since they can't be blinded by dim vision, but slowing them with the Cripify and running worked fine as well. And then there was just Baal. The Lord of Destruction does not handle being slowed very well, and we came prepared with all kinds of slows. The slow from Kelpie Snare, Holy Freeze and the Cripify made Baal a joke compared to some of the other obstacles we had to overcome in this run. In the end it was unclear if this ended up being a Poison Dagger Necromancer or a Dim Vision and Emilio Necromancer. Poison Dagger was a lot of fun to use, but for Hell it's just very underwhelming, even with 60 skill points invested between the skill itself and its synergies. Maybe lower resist would have been the key to make my poison damage good enough, but I would not have been able to stay alive without Dim Vision and the Cripify. Just no way. But either way, I was happy to finish this challenge because this was one hell of a grind. A big thank you to all of the goblins who have chosen to become members of the channel. Your support means a lot, both to me and to Emilio. Here's another fun challenge run to watch next. Thank you for watching this one, and I'll see you next time.